Hello, everyone. I'm so glad you're here to join me to talk about powerful nutrition during a pandemic. I am Jocelyn Dubin. I'm a registered dietitian with a master's degree in nutritional science, and I really want to take this time to support you in feeling empowered to take care of your own health and nutrition during COVID-19. I know that we all are experiencing a lot of stress around this disease, and whether or not those that we love and know are going to be affected. Some of you have already experienced being affected yourselves and having loved ones affected. But I really want to take this time to flip the script and really talk about how to feel more empowered as opposed to feeling worried and afraid and stressed. Because when we look at our plates, there is power there. And I really want you to be able to utilize the power on your plate. So let's get started by talking a little bit about the stats so that you're really aware of why it's so important for African Americans in specific to focus on what they're eating as a way to combat COVID-19. So we know that African Americans make up 13.4% of all Americans. So we are absolutely a minority. However, when it comes to this disease, we are not in those numbers showing as much to be a minority. So what we're seeing is 17.5% of Americans COVID-19 cases are African Americans. So we're 13.4% of the population, but we're 17.9% of the COVID cases thus far. And that's based on CDC data when race was actually provided. So we know that already those stats don't match. Then when we look at the death rate from COVID-19, 20.6% of the COVID-19 deaths in America have been African Americans. So again, we're 13.4% of the population, but we're 20.6% of the death rate. That is not okay. We really need to do all we can to try to boost our immunity, guard our immunity, so that we can bring those stats down in terms of both the contract rates and the death rates. So what does nutrition have to do with it? Well, we know that nutrition plays a huge role in our immunity. And in particular, so far, even though this disease is new, we do know that there is conclusive data around vitamin D and COVID-19. So I want to kind of take you through that information, and then I'll take you through one of our minerals that is showing some promise with regard to boosting our immunity too. So vitamin D deficiency is by far the most common deficiency in the world and in the United States and in my practice. So I've been a dietitian for 18 years, and I see over and over again people coming in, giving me their lab reports, and most often people are vitamin D deficient, African American or not. But when it comes to African Americans, we're at even higher risk of vitamin D deficiency. And the reason for that is that one of our primary ways of getting vitamin D is through the sun. And the sun has to actually go through the skin layer and convert from something called tachysterol to cholecalciferol, two fancy words for different types of vitamin D. Well, because we have so much melanin in our skin, which is a beautiful, beautiful signature of us, but also tends to actually impair the ability of making that transfer from tachysterol to cholecalciferol. So as a result, it's harder for us to get vitamin D because of the darkness of our skin. And we know that there are higher rates of COVID-19 for those who are vitamin D deficient. So by default, because our skin is darker and it's harder for us to absorb vitamin D, we are more likely to be deficient, and therefore we are at higher risk of COVID. So what do we do about that? Well, there's a lot we can do nutritionally, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, but I want to talk about why there's a connection between vitamin D and COVID, because it may seem like it doesn't make sense. Why this particular vitamin? Why not all vitamins? Well, vitamin D, we know, is really tied to inflammation and immunity. And in particular, we know that there are higher rates of respiratory diseases for people who have low vitamin D, like asthma. So those who experience asthma, oftentimes if they go and get a blood test and they're having really pronounced asthma they can't get a control of, it's often because their vitamin D is low. That's not the only reason, but that is certainly one of the reasons why they may be seeing persistent asthma that's hard to control. When it comes to COVID, we know that higher rates of acute respiratory failure happen if someone has low vitamin D and someone is actually COVID positive. So we don't want to deal with any compromise of the lungs. And if you don't have good vitamin D, your lungs can be compromised in a number of different ways. We also know that when patients are in the hospital and they have COVID-19, if we give them vitamin D, it can actually reduce how severe the COVID-19 is while they're in the hospital. So beforehand, we want good vitamin D so that we don't get COVID. If for some reason we still get COVID, we want vitamin D when we're in the hospital so that we reduce the severity of how it is actually presenting for us. So vitamin D plays a huge role in COVID-19. Who's at higher risk besides the fact that I talked about us because our skin is darker? Well, we know elders are at higher risk. Why? Because some of them aren't eating as well. They're not getting out as much into the sunshine. There's a number of different factors in why elders are at higher risk. But we know that they are at higher risk for vitamin D deficiency. We also know those who are of higher weight are higher risk for vitamin D deficiency. So if your body mass index is over 30, and there are very simple ways you can look online to calculate your body mass index, something I do as a dietitian for my patients, but you can do it too. So if your body mass index is over 30, you're at higher risk of vitamin D deficiency. So you really want to pay attention to that. And we also know those with higher blood pressure are at higher risk of vitamin D deficiency. So you want to really know who you are, know what your current risks are, and really try to do everything you can to use nutrition to boost your vitamin D so that you are at lower risk of COVID-19. So what can we do nutritionally? I keep mentioning that I'm going to talk about it. Here it is. So we want you to be empowered. And as a dietitian, I feel it's very important to tell people what to eat, not what not to eat. And a lot of times you'll read, oh, don't have this, or it's bad to eat that, or you shouldn't be eating this. And my whole stance is if you don't know what to eat, you can't live on air. So I really want to help you to get some concrete foods in your pantry, in your refrigerator, on your countertop, so that you understand what you can do to feel empowered with regard to boosting your vitamin D. So first and foremost, you want to make sure you know your vitamin D from the start. So it's important to have a vitamin D blood test, and I recommend once a year. The goal level for your vitamin D is 50 to 60 nanograms per milliliter. So when you get your vitamin D test results, usually the scale is 30 to 70 or 30 to 100. It depends on which lab is actually doing the analysis. But I want you to look at that number. And if your number is 31 and the start of the scale is 30, that's like getting a D minus in school. We don't want that. We want you in the healthy high end of the range, especially as an African American person, because you know it's harder for you to absorb. We have lower rates, we have more deficiency. So you're looking for 50 to 60 as your goal level for your vitamin D. So get your vitamin D tested. It is very, very, very easy to do. It is a blood test. You don't have to go to the doctor and then ask the doctor for the lab slip to go to the lab. You can simply just email or call your doctor's office and say, I'd like to get my vitamin D blood level tested. Can you please fax the lab? And then you just go straight to the lab instead of having to go to the doctor's office and the lab. Because as we all know, we do not need to be out in public more than is necessary with this pandemic. It's also possible to work through some labs that will do outdoor testing. There's one that I really appreciate called Trava Lab, TRAVALAB. And what they'll do is if you can get a doctor's order for the vitamin D test and have that piece of paper in hand, you can call Travelab and someone will come to your house and you can have them in the front yard, the backyard, the side yard. They don't even have to come in and they can actually do that blood draw for you and they'll charge you a small fee for coming out and doing the blood draw. And then of course you want to make sure insurance is going to cover that vitamin D test so that you're not surprised by a bill. So having said all that, get your vitamin D tested and make sure that you are in the goal range, not just within the normal range. Again, the range is 30 to 100 or 30 to 70, and you really want to be between 50 and 60. Okay, so if your vitamin D is low, let's say you got tested and your vitamin D is low, then the next thing that you want to do is you want to consider taking a vitamin D supplement because as I'm going to show you in a minute, you can get vitamin D from food, but most of us aren't getting enough from food. So I'm going to tell you the foods to include, and I really want you to work on that. But I also want you to have a supplement as a backup if you are deficient. A lot of people say, oh, shouldn't I just run out and get a vitamin anyway? Aren't vitamins healthy? It is best to take vitamins with data beforehand. So we don't just throw a bunch of pills in hoping that's going to solve the problem. We want to know where you're starting from. So getting your test first is the most prudent way to go about figuring out whether or not you're a good candidate for a supplement. If you are deficient and you need a supplement, then I recommend that you use your number from your vitamin D test to figure out how much you should be taking in that supplement or your dosage, right? So some people need 1,000 units, some people need 2,000, some people need 5,000, some people need a short dose of 10,000. I wouldn't want you to overdo it because you can end up making kidney stones. That's no fun. But I also don't want you to underdo it. So again, use that data from your own body to guide how much vitamin D you take. Don't just run out and get a pill. And always, of course, get your tests yearly so that you know whether or not you need to adjust your dosage. And then, of course, I want you to eat and drink your vitamin D, and that's regardless of what your vitamin D blood level is. So if you say, well, I don't feel comfortable right now going to a lab and I don't have the funds to have somebody come to the house and test me, I'm just going to go out and get a supplement. Well, first, let's just back up and remember that food is medicine, and it's our best medicine. And it's what we've always had available before all these supplements were even on the market. So let's use foods and beverages to get you your vitamin D every day, regardless of what your blood level is. So finally, here we are. What are those foods? So I want you to eat more mushrooms. And I know some people love them and some people are like, ooh, I don't like mushrooms. I want you to open up to maybe you haven't found the mushroom that you like in the way that you like it. Some of you say, no problem, I love mushrooms. Great. But I want you to eat more mushrooms. Here's the caveat: always cooked, never raw. You cannot get immune benefit from a raw mushroom. So don't slice them and put them in your salad. Some of you are like, ooh, I've been doing that. That's okay. We're learning as we go, right? That's why we're on the planet. Every day is an opportunity for learning. But I want you to eat them always cooked, never raw. So, for instance, I have here some shiitake mushrooms, and those shiitake mushrooms are a beautiful support for your immune system, as are all mushrooms that have been exposed to ultraviolet light, which is everything that we find when we go to the grocery store. So what I would do with those shiitake mushrooms is I would slice them up. I would put them in a pan. If I was making an Asian style meal, I might add some sesame oil, or if I was making a meal that was more kind of straight ahead, I might add some olive oil, and then I would saute those up. Maybe I'm going to add some fresh herbs like rosemary in there or some ginger, depends on what the recipe is. But you really want to get some heat on those mushrooms. When we heat the mushrooms, we release the beta glucans, which are in the actual cap or fibers of the mushroom, was kind of what makes it bendy. And those beta glucans help you to make more white blood cells. And your white blood cells help you to fight off the virus. So, food is phenomenal medicine. I really want you to use it to your advantage, but you need to cook those mushrooms rather than have them raw. You could obviously use button, portobello, cremini. There's lots of different mushrooms out there. I just want you to use them weekly and find ways that you like them so that you're actually motivated to use them on a regular basis. Also, non-dairy yogurts are a great way to get your vitamin D. So I have Kite Hill is one of my favorite brands of non-dairy yogurt. You can find this at lots of different grocery stores, you know, your standard grocery stores like a kind of Safeway, Kroger, as well as Whole Foods. You can also find it in some of our smaller natural food stores. But what's great about a non-dairy yogurt is many African Americans are lactose intolerant. So I don't want you to feel like, oh, in order to get my vitamin D, I have to eat dairy. And if I'm going to eat dairy, I'm going to suffer as a result of it. You can use non-dairy sources if you are lactose intolerant and get just as much vitamin D as if you were having a dairy source of yogurt. So that's an almond-based yogurt. There's also cashew yogurts. There's split pea yogurt, believe it or not. There's soy yogurts. There's coconut yogurt. There's a lot of non-dairy options. All of the manufactured store-bought yogurts have vitamin D included in them because they're smart. They know between dairy and non-dairy, no one's going to buy the non-dairy if it doesn't have the nutritional value. So the vitamin D has been added in to those non-dairy yogurts just as it would be in a dairy yogurt. If you don't have lactose intolerance, you could also include dairy yogurt, and that would be another way for you to get your vitamin D. And for some people, they say, well, I have to do a half step. I'll use like a goat milk yogurt or a sheep's milk yogurt because cow's milk doesn't do well on my stomach. That's fine. If you need to go to a goat milk or sheep's milk yogurt instead of cow's milk, that's fine. But again, you have the non-dairy options if you're a person that really just doesn't do well with dairy. Fatty fish is another way for you to get your vitamin D. So I want you to really think about, if you are not vegetarian or vegan, including fatty fish in your diet. So an example would be something as simple as kind of a wild Pacific sardines. And you can find these again. All of our grocery stores have sardines. Doesn't matter where you shop, there's going to be canned sardines available. A lot of people are like, ooh, that is too fishy for me. Look, again, find the way that you like it. You probably just haven't met the way that you like it yet, right? So, for example, you could treat this like tuna fish. It's boneless and skinless. So you can take that and you could mash it up with a fork. You could add in your celery, your onions, some dill, some mustard, maybe a little bit of mayo if that's what you're into, some paprika, some salt, some cayenne, and really make it into what would be similar to tuna fish. And that way you're not looking at it, it's not looking at you. There aren't any bones you're going to crunch through if you get the boneless ones. There's no heads on them. So just mash it up and make it into a pate. And that way you'll be able to find more vitamin D through, let's say, a simple lunch versus if you were just having a turkey sandwich. Because turkey's not going to give you that vitamin D, but the sardines are. If you're not a fan of sardines, maybe you like other fish, salmon, trout, like rainbow trout, halibut. These are all great options for vitamin D. So you can use those as well if you really aren't a fan of the sardines. But I want you to remember food is medicine. So start intentionally including that fatty fish in your diet each week. Then we have store-bought and dairy and non-dairy milks. So whether or not you are a fan of using a soy milk, oat milk, almond milk, cashew milk, black sesame milk, I mean, we have it all now. But what the stores have is always going to be fortified with vitamin D. Why? Because, again, in order to compete with the dairy industry, the nutrition must be similar. And so what lots of these manufacturers have done is put just as much vitamin D in their non-dairy milk as you would find in a dairy-based milk. And of course, in the case of some milks, they naturally have some of these nutrients already embedded in them. So it's not all added in. Some of it is naturally occurring within the food. So an example might be a soy milk. Perhaps you're using a soy milk instead of using dairy milk in your cereal, in your smoothies, in your coffee, in your tea. That's fine. So the more that you can incorporate a non-dairy milk that is store-bought as opposed to homemade, you're going to get that vitamin D on the same level as a dairy milk. If you do not have lactose intolerance and you find that dairy milk is fine and you don't have any digestive issues in having it, or asthma or skin issues, those are the three most prevalent issues people have that tell us that they don't process dairy well, then go ahead and use your dairy milk. And again, cow, sheep, goat, whatever is working for you. It's going to be different for each person. So I want to give you a lot of options of how to get that vitamin D, but I want you to also be mindful of what works best for you. So these are all ways we get our vitamin D. For review: mushrooms, we have our fatty fish, we have our non-dairy yogurts, we have our non-dairy milks. Those are fantastic ways to get vitamin D. Lastly, it is an unsuspecting place to find vitamin D, but I want you to think about having small amounts of calcium and vitamin D fortified orange juice. Now, I know a lot of people say, oh, I don't drink juice, it's too much sugar. But when I say small amounts, I'm talking like a 4-ounce glass. It's what I call your grandmother's juice glass. It's the old school juice glasses. Now, if you were to incorporate a little bit of orange juice each day, again, about 4 ounces, a half a cup, it's not too much sugar. It's the same amount of sugar as if you ate about 1.5 oranges. And that would be a beautiful way for you to get more vitamin D. Not all orange juice is vitamin D fortified. So you need to see on the front of the label that it actually says fortified with vitamin D. An example is Trader Joe's. Trader Joe's has a calcium and vitamin D fortified orange juice. It's very clear on the front of their label that it has vitamin D in it. So I want you to take away from this, Not all orange juice, only the one that says it has vitamin D in it. But that's a great way for you to get your vitamin D each day if you have a small amount. And why small amounts? Because we're trying to avoid diabetes, we're trying to avoid excess weight, trying to avoid excess sugar that may depress the immune system. But we know that orange juice actually can be really beneficial in small quantities because the vitamin D, and of course, it has vitamin C as well. So we talked about vitamin D as a way for you to increase your immunity and so therefore fighting against COVID-19. But there's a mineral that I mentioned earlier, and I didn't say what it was, but there is a mineral which we now have conclusive studies done to show also supports the decrease in the risk for COVID-19, and that is zinc. So I really want you to think about whether or not you've ever had a zinc blood test. Most people will tell me, no, I don't think so. I'll have to go back and look at my labs. It is not common for doctors to test your blood zinc level. So most of us have no idea what our zinc level is. But I will tell you that zinc is partially responsible for both the development and the functioning of the immune system. And that's really important. Zinc helps us heal. It heals wounds, it heals tissue that is internal, so our lung tissue. And if we don't have enough zinc, we're at risk of having issues with our immune system. We know that zinc deficiency increases the risk for all infectious diseases, whether that's the flu, the common cold, COVID-19, all sorts of different infectious diseases are actually very correlated with zinc deficiency. Again, there are a number of reasons those diseases can occur, but zinc deficiency makes them more likely to occur. And the World Health Organization estimates that 33% of the world is zinc deficient. 1/3 of the world, that's a lot of people. So we have to assume that 1/3 of African Americans are also zinc deficient, at least, right? So if that's the case, we know that zinc deficiency is the root of 16% of the serious respiratory diseases that we have worldwide. And therefore, we're at higher risk of getting those diseases if we're zinc deficient. So I want you to really think about how you can boost your zinc intake as a way of being empowered to protect yourself against COVID-19. So who's at highest risk of zinc deficiency? You're probably wondering, am I zinc deficient or not? You said doctors don't usually test for it. Well, you're at higher risk for zinc deficiency if you already have asthma. You're at higher risk if you already have COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. You're at higher risk if you have high blood pressure or heart disease or any other cardiovascular condition, atherosclerosis, clogging of the arteries, high cholesterol, had to have a bypass, had a heart attack, something of that sort. You're at higher risk of zinc deficiency. If you have diabetes, you're at higher risk. If you have prediabetes, that's kind of a harbinger or a warning sign that you're at risk. If you have kidney disease, if you have cancer, if you have an autoimmune condition, let's say Hashimoto's, thyroiditis, so problems with your thyroid, or you have rheumatoid arthritis, those are autoimmune diseases, you're at higher risk. If you have Crohn's or colitis, that's also autoimmune, you're at higher risk. So that's a lot of people at high risk of zinc deficiency. So what do we do about that? Well, again, we can be empowered, right? Food is medicine. So we're going to use it to our advantage to try to fight against COVID-19. So if finances permit, I want you to have a zinc blood test. Again, data guides our practice nutritionally. So what does that mean? Well, it's not a common test ordered by doctors. If you called your doctor or your doctor's office and said, can I get a zinc test? They'd say, why? They have to have a reason or a rationale in order to get insurance to actually cover the cost of that test. Otherwise, you get stuck with the bill. And sometimes you don't know until that bill shows up. I don't want you out a lot of money just because you were trying to find out your zinc level. So there is a third-party lab that I often use with my patients, and that lab is actually called Life Extension. And so online it's www.lifeextension.com. And if you go onto that site, you'll see there's actually labs that will test your vitamin or your zinc level. And Life Extension's zinc test is like $34.50. It's not a lot of money, but for some people, it's more than they can afford right now, and I totally get that. So I'm going to give you some foods that you can eat just to boost your zinc level, even if you can't afford to get tested. If you can afford to get tested, I recommend doing so because particularly in this pandemic, we who are lowest in zinc are at very high risk of contracting COVID-19. So if you get the test done and you're deficient or your zinc is low, then I would have you consider taking a 15 milligram zinc supplement every day. And zinc is very affordable. It's easy to come by. All of our drugstores have it. It comes in many different forms. I'd recommend zinc gluconate or zinc picolinate as the type that you choose if you're going to get a zinc tablet from the grocery store or the health food store or your favorite vitamin shop. If you take a zinc supplement every day, you want to pay attention to your iron and your copper blood levels as well. So I know you're saying, oh, she wants me to get more tests done. Well, it is good to have this data, but if you can't manage to get tested right now for a number of different reasons, just make sure that if you are someone who takes an iron supplement, that you take iron at one end of the day and your zinc on the opposite end of the day, because you don't want your iron and zinc to compete for absorption with each other. And they will absolutely do that if you take it at the same time, which means you can be boosting your zinc, but making yourself more anemic by lowering your iron. And we don't want to do that. We want you healthy all around. So if you take iron supplements, then you want to take your zinc at the opposite end of the day. So for instance, iron with breakfast and zinc with dinner. Also, your copper blood levels are impacted by zinc. So if you take a multivitamin that has copper in it, you should take your multi at the opposite end of the day as your zinc. Most people don't take copper by itself, which is why I went straight to a multivitamin. So if you are taking a multivitamin, you might want to take your multivitamin in the morning and then you take your zinc at night. Okay? And that way you're not helping one thing and harming another. Now, for those of us who say, I'm not going to take any pills, I don't like taking pills, or I already take too many pills, I'm not going to eat the blood test, I can't do that right now for a number of reasons, we can be empowered by eating more foods with zinc. So, what does that look like? Well, we know legumes, like I have here some peas. I just keep all my peas in all my beans in jars and glass jars, and I put them in the cabinet. And that way, every time I open the cabinet, I'm reminded because I can see through that jar. Oh yeah, I need to finish making those peas, or I need to make those black-eyed peas, or how about kidney beans this week? So you may want to keep them in something that's clear so that you can see them and you're reminded about it, and then they don't go bad after sitting in the cabinet for a long period of time. So all legumes are high in zinc, whether it be, like I mentioned, the black-eyed peas, the kidney beans, the zinc. But I want you to really rotate the beans that you're including every week so that you get varying levels of nutrition besides the zinc. So one week, if you had black beans, maybe the next week you do lentils. The next week you do peas. Maybe if one night you made a pinto bean dish, then 3 nights later you're making a garbanzo bean dish. Really rotate your legumes for added nutrients beyond the zinc, as well as getting the zinc. Nuts are also high in zinc, so if you do not have allergies, I want you to include a variety of nuts in your diet. So again, maybe breakfast might have some almonds in it, and then maybe you have a salad at dinner and you throw some cashews in it or pistachios. Maybe you have a snack the next day and you pull out the walnuts. So again, rotate what you've got on hand so that you have a variety of different nutrients that you're getting, and then you're always from all nuts getting zinc. Seeds are also high in zinc, so pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, hemp, flax, all of those are going to be wonderful sources of zinc. And then whole grains. So I have in front of me here some oats. And I just, again, clear jar. I just keep my grains in a clear jar so that I know how much I have and I remember what I have and I can use it up before I go to the store and get more. So maybe you have your oats as a way of getting in some zinc because it's an easy breakfast. You can make a big pot on a Monday and then eat off of it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It's affordable. Maybe it's brown rice that you're eating or quinoa. There's a lot of different grains that you can include in your diet that will really help you to get in enough zinc to fight off COVID-19. Now, if your cholesterol is low and your blood pressure is healthy and your weight is fine and you don't have any major health problems, you also could get your zinc from shellfish, beef, poultry, and pork. But I really focus on the plant foods and I minimize the animal foods, especially those larger animals like cows, pigs, if you have underlying health conditions, because we know the higher order animals have more fat. And the more fat they have, the more that can actually spark more inflammation for you, which can make those disease processes worse. So I'm not saying everybody needs to be vegetarian or vegan. What I'm saying is really make sure when you look at your plate, the majority of what's there is from plants and the minority of what's there is from animal foods. That's how the areas of the world that have the longest lifespan and the least disease are actually living. They'll take a big stir fry and put tiny little pieces of beef on top. They're not having a giant steak. They're not eating, a rack of ribs on their own. They're eating small amounts of meat with a huge amount of vegetable. So I want us to do the same in order to guard our health and in order to make sure that we're not making our cholesterol worse or our asthma worse or our kidney disease worse. So that's something to consider. So there's one more nutrient which doesn't actually come from food, but there is an indirect route to get some foods in to boost it. And I want to make sure you know about that in fighting COVID-19 as well. And that is melatonin. And some of you probably are like, well, melatonin, I take that to get good sleep. Yes, many people use melatonin as a sleep support. Usually comes in a little pill, 3 milligrams or 1 milligram, up to even 10 milligrams. But what we know is that melatonin is a hormone made in the pineal gland of the brain. And what it does is it actually decreases inflammation and it decreases oxidation of your healthy tissues. So it keeps your tissues really strong and healthy as opposed to having them degraded or compromised by what we call free radicals. So there's a lot of research being done right now on melatonin. Unlike vitamin D, unlike zinc, there's no conclusive research yet, but studies are suggesting that melatonin may help in the treatment of COVID-19 until we have a vaccine. So it's kind of an interim step. And the reason that we think it might help is because one of the things that happens in COVID-19 is we get a lot of inflammation in the body. That's why people are put on steroids when they have COVID-19, because steroids bring down inflammation. Melatonin also brings down inflammation. So it is something for us to keep watching for, really looking at those studies that come out. You can just put in your Google search field COVID-19 plus melatonin every couple months, and you'll see more and more data is coming online with regard to melatonin to fight COVID-19. So what does that have to do with food? Well, we can make more melatonin if we eat more tryptophan. And tryptophan is an amino acid. It's like a small part of protein. And so if we up our tryptophan, we'll make more melatonin from the pineal gland in our brain. How do we do that? More spinach. For if you are a person who uses spirulina in your shakes, more spirulina. If you eat fatty fish, more fatty fish. For people who eat turkey, turkey is a source of tryptophan. Soybeans are a source of tryptophan. Egg white is a source of tryptophan. So all of those can be included so that by having more tryptophan, you can make more melatonin. And by making melatonin, you can decrease inflammation in all of your tissues, particularly the lung tissue and your cardiovascular tissues, to reduce the risk of COVID-19. So food, again, incredibly powerful, always excites me every day. And I want you to be able to feel empowered by what's on your plate as well. So let's put this all together. What are some concrete meals you can have in order to decrease the risk of COVID-19 and make sure that you feel empowered in taking care of your overall immunity? Let's look at breakfast. So let's say for breakfast you were to have a bowl of oatmeal and you were to sprinkle some pumpkin seeds on that oatmeal once you cooked it up. Maybe you take a little dollop of a vanilla dairy or non-dairy yogurt, put it on top, and you have a little glass, remember 4 ounces of your vitamin D and calcium fortified orange juice. By having that meal, that oatmeal just provided you with a lot of zinc. So did the pumpkin seeds. The yogurt just gave you a lot of vitamin D, and so did the orange juice. So that's a zinc and vitamin D rich breakfast. Not costly, and pretty easy to put together, even if life is really crazy. Again, I said you can make that bowl of oatmeal on the weekend and make it big enough where it's several servings so that you can eat off it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So that's a great way to boost your immunity and fight COVID-19. What about for lunch? What's a simple lunch we can do that incorporates vitamin D and zinc and helps us to really reduce our risk of COVID? Canned vegetarian baked beans. It's a great option for someone who says, I don't have a lot of time. I got 15 Zoom meetings. I got a lot going on with kids or taking care of somebody in my life that needs my help right now. I can't spend a lot of time in the kitchen in the middle of the day. It's perfectly fine to open up a can of beans and warm those up. And baked beans in particular are really high in zinc. And if you're vegetarian, you don't have to have the ones that have pieces of pork in it. You can actually get vegetarian baked beans. So all of our grocery stores have them. Trader Joe's is one example. Amy's is another brand you'll find at Safeway and Whole Foods and other grocery stores. That is a vegetarian line of baked beans to give you a lot of zinc. What are we going to put those beans on? How about some quinoa? Now, of course, not everybody has tried quinoa, not everybody likes quinoa. I find quinoa to be the best if you cook it in broth rather than cooking it in water. And that way it gives it a lot more flavor than if it were cooked in the water. And then you put those baked beans on top, and all the juices from the beans end up in that quinoa, brings in even more flavor. So maybe you just have a bowl of baked beans with quinoa, and then on the side you have a little glass of soy milk. If you do that, your baked beans are going to be high in zinc. Your quinoa is also high in zinc, and your soy milk is high in vitamin D. Again, another zinc and vitamin D rich meal to fight the risk of COVID. What about for dinner? Well, at dinner time, sometimes we have a little bit more time to prep something, and sometimes we have to do it in advance, right? And that's okay. But I would recommend something like grilled sockeye salmon because salmon is very high in vitamin D. It's also great for protein, omega-3, it goes on and on, vitamin A. And then maybe you saute up some mushrooms and you put those sauteed mushrooms on top of your salmon. And then all that goes on some brown rice. And then maybe you have some spinach, whether it be a spinach salad, or maybe you want to wilt some spinach and put that on the plate too. Well, your salmon is going to be very high in vitamin D. So are your mushrooms. And then when you get to your brown rice, remember all whole grains are high in zinc. So that's a great source of zinc. And then your spinach, as I mentioned, is high in melatonin. So you've got a vitamin D, zinc, and melatonin rich dinner that you can put together so that you got power on your plate so that you can reduce your risk of COVID-19. These are all things that I feel are very accessible to most of us. And I want you to really remember that you cannot prevent this disease from occurring, but you can reduce your risk. And one of the best ways to reduce your risk, besides what we know, of course, wearing your mask, washing your hands, making sure that you're distanced, doing more outdoor versus indoor activity, all those things are very important, and we hear those over and over again. But what I'm also here to tell you is food is medicine, and I want you to use your food as medicine so that you can reduce your risk of COVID-19. It has been a pleasure to be with you today. I hope that all of you stay healthy, stay well, stay safe, and use that food as medicine. Take care, everyone.